Emily Dickinson, The Poetic Genius. Biography and summary of top 10 poems by Emily Dickinson. Hello and welcome to the discourse. We are discussing American literature. American poets were known for their experimentation and uses of new structures in their poetry. Walt Whitman is known as the father of free verses in poetry, and another American poet, his contemporary, who brilliantly used open verses, was Emily Dickinson. Emily Dickinson was born on December 10, 1830 at Amherst in Massachusetts. Since her childhood, she was a reluctant introvert person who found it hard to mingle with people and often she remained lonely. She was even considered eccentric. Emily had a liking for white clothing. She never married, and while she had some friends, almost all of her were in touch with her only through letters and correspondences. She never married, and because of her calm nature along with her habit of enjoying solitude, she was known as the Nun of Amherst, a reclusive American poet. She was a prolific writer who wrote around some 1800 poems. However, only 10 of her poems were published during her lifetime, and all the fame and name that she attained was only after her death. Emily Dickinson was very much influenced by British poet Robert Browning and his wife Eliza Barret Browning, whose poems she very much liked. Another poet who inspired and influenced Emily was John Keats. She was advised not to read Walt Whitman because of the rumors of his disgracefulness in his poems. The very few 10 poems that were published during her lifetime were also heavily edited before being published to suit the current norms of the poetry of that time. She uses short lines in her poems and hardly gave any title to any of her poems. She uses dashes, slant rhyme, and unconventional capitalization and punctuation in her poems. At the age of 18, one of her family friend and a student of her father, Benjamin Franklin Newton, introduced her to Ralph Waldo Emerson and gave her Emerson's book Essays first series. Emily was highly inspired by the naturalism and transcendentalism of Emerson. Newton suffered death due to tuberculosis at an early age. His death might have affected Emily Dickinson, whose main themes of her poetry remained death, immortality, nature, society, aesthetics, nature, and spirituality. Her first collection of poetry was published in 1890, 4 years after her death. However, this first print of her poems was heavily edited. In 1955, Thomas H. Johnson published an unaltered collection of her poems by the title The Poems of Emily Dickinson. Emily Dickinson died on May 5, 1886, and the epiphany that is written on the tombstone of her grave is Called Back, which was composed by herself. She wrote a huge number of poems. We will discuss 10 most popular, widely read, and important poems. So let us begin with her first poem, which begins as Because I Could Not Stop for Death. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. This is one of the most talked about and popular poems of Dickinson, in which she personifies death as a human, her lover. Emily Dickinson never gave any title to any of her poems, and all of them are known by the first line of her poems. However, the publishers titled this poem as The Chariot when it was published in 1890. The basic theme of this poem is death, and Dickinson suggests that one should not fear of death, as it is a natural part of an endless immortal cycle of nature. Along with death, Dickinson also personifies immortality of nature. Dickinson sees death as a friend, a lover, and suggests that the death was always with her, and death, as a gentleman, took her on a chariot. There are 3 persons on this chariot. First is death, who is riding the chariot. Second is the poet, and the third one is the immortality of nature. The poem is written in matter of fact tone. Like anyone else, the poet couldn't stop for death for her love of life. However, as a true lover, death stops for her and asks her to join him in his chariot with a hope to be with immortality, who is also present in the chariot. They do not take any luggage but just their own self. The death is in no haste or hurry. It is very gentle, calm, and waiting. As they start the journey, the poet gives up all the leisure and labors and is set free. The poem is ambiguous as it doesn't clarify whether the poet is already dead or is it the journey towards death. In the second stanza, the poet, death, and immortality pass through a school and they observe the children. Then they observe gazing grain and then they see the sunset. These three pictures signify childhood, youth, and then the old age. As the sun sets, the poet starts feeling cold as she is wearing only a thin gown of very fine cloth, and then they see the house of death whose roof is so high that it is invisible. The poet suggests that her whole life of childhood, youth, and old age appears to end within a short day, as now she is with her lover death. And then the poet suggests that ultimately the immortality personified has embraced her as she feels that the chariot of the death is moving towards eternity. So this was the main theme and summary of the poem, Because I Could Not Stop for Death. The second poem of Dickinson that we will discuss is Hope is a Thing with Feathers. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. In this poem, Dickinson again shows her homiletic style by metaphorically describing hope as a singing bird that perches in the soul of an individual. Dickinson introduces her metaphor in the opening lines as hope is a thing with feathers that perches in the soul. Then she explains the nature of hope, how she continues to sing despite hardships, unabashed in the storm, and despite all the hardships, hope appears anywhere, everywhere, in the most cold deserts and the loneliest seas. The phrases used by Dickinson are chilliest land and strangest seas. The poet says that hope, the bird, appears everywhere, ready to cheer the poet in all conditions. Even in the most drastic conditions, hope, the bird, appears and continues to reinvigorate the poet. The poet says that this little bird never stops singing. However, the bird sings just the tune, but no words. The poet feels that the strength of the song of hope, the bird, but there are no understandable words. This bird, hope, keeps inspiring the poet in most difficult situations, saying, "Please don't lose hope. I am with you. We can win this struggle." Hope helps the poet to keep stresses away. Only extreme violent storms may put a pause on the song of this bird, which is her hope personified. And for all these services and help, the bird hope demands nothing from the poet. So that's the beauty of hope. The bird that while it helps you and encourages you against all odds and inspires you to reach higher heights, it never asks anything in return from you. The third poem that we will discuss is The Soul Selects Her Own Society. The soul selects her own society, then shuts the door to her divine majority, present no more. The poet suggests that the soul has the power and right to decide its companions. We often go through this. We meet people and easily mingle with them, and we enjoy chit-chatting with them, enjoying out time with them, and we also meet people with whom we do not feel comfortable, and no matter how much they try, we cannot mingle with them. So the poet says that the soul has its own power to choose the kind of people it wants to be with. And then the soul shuts the door to the majority while enjoying the divine companionship with the chosen companions. Divine defines the poet's inner consciousness, never letting anyone else entering in its realm. No matter how rich and affluent a person is, chariots, no matter how important he is, emperor kneeling against her to befriend her. The soul doesn't let him in once it has shut down its doors. The soul has a stern nature. In the next lines of the poem, the poet suggests that even from a huge crowd, an ample nation, the soul easily finds out the one to settle with, and it doesn't let anyone else to enter its realm, closing the doors of her heart for anyone else, guarding it like an immovable stone. It appears as a tragic love poem in these lines. Dickinson used metaphors and imagery in a focused, skilled manner in this poem. The next poem of Emily Dickinson that we will discuss begins as I taste a liquor never brewed. I taste a liquor never brewed, from the tankards scooped in pearl. Not all the vats upon the Rhine yield such an alcohol. This poem again offers excellent metaphorical imagery of the nature. The poet shows a bottomless love for the beauty of nature and suggests the loveliness of nature as an enchanting, addictive liquor that she has tasted. This liquor is such unique and divine that even the best wines of Rhine are no match to this essence of nature. Rhine is a river that flows in Germany and France. The wines produced from the grape plantations in the valley of Rhine River are considered the best in the world. But for the poet, the liquor of nature that she tasted, that never was brewed, is much better than the best man-made wine. The poet is so enchanted with this natural beauty and finds so aligned, so attached with the nature, landscape and wildlife that she feels getting drunker than even the bees and the butterflies sipping on the nectar. This liquor of nature is so divine, mysterious and magical, something impossibly good it appears, and confusingly it was never brewed. What this suggests that it is wholly natural and not man-made. The poet makes the reader realize that whatever this liquor of nature is, it is very precious, very special, and it is served in tankards scooped in pearls. In this second and third stanza, the poet explains this liquor, revealing that it is nothing but the natural fresh air, the dew, the flower, and the summer sky full of all bounty and wonders. She depicts the blue sky as an infinite series of inns of molten blue. The poet further suggests that her pleasure in the nature is outlandish and she is being a debauchee, completely enamored by the nature, addicted to the liquor of the nature. The poet's joyful inebriation brings down the heaven to the earth as this nature has connected her to the spiritual world. The seraphs, saints are eager to watch her in drunken state as they gossip about her. When they see her inebriated in drunken state of nature, spiritualism, they move their heads in disapproving manner. This natural taste has heightened her soul to such height she can lean against the sun itself. The celestial beings have become her neighbors. The fifth poem of Dickinson that we will discuss is I died for the beauty but was scarce. I died for beauty but was scarce, adjusted in the tomb when one who died for truth was lain in an adjoining room. The poem begins as I died for beauty but was scarcely adjusted in the tomb. This poem shows the influence of John Keats, whom Emily hugely admired. Keats' poem Beauty is Truth, Truth is Beauty, from Ode in a Grecian is the direct inspiration for this poem by Emily. In this poem, she also expresses that truth and beauty are same in her own imaginative allegorical manner. This poem is an allegorical death fantasy in which Dickinson is depicting her imaginative experiences after her death, though she is very much alive. Emily creates grotesque image of death and then fills it with beauty while strongly suggesting that the beauty is truth, death is the ultimate truth. The poet says that she died for her want of beauty, but right after that, even before she could adjust in the tomb for her afterlife, another man also died, and he was buried in a tomb next to her. The man asks her for what she died, and she answers that she died for beauty. It shows yearning for high ideals of martyrdom for beauty. The man says that he died for truth. and hence the poet and the man are kin, similar, brethren, or companion. Why? Because the man says that beauty and the truth both are same, both are one. Now the two brethren who met on a night in their tombs continue to talk. This shows optimism in afterlife, after death, despite the terror of death, and then comes the macabre. The friendly conversation between the two ultimately turns mute and silent as the moss grows and covers their lips and further grows to cover names on their tombstones. The poem depicts death in grotesque, frightening, compelling, yet comforting manner. The next poem is I felt a funeral in my brain. I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro kept treading, till it seemed that sense was breaking through. The poem begins as I felt a funeral in my brain. The poem depicts the situation of a person who is terminally ill, at the edge of losing his mind, senses, at the edge of madness and probable death. The poet says that she feels as if a funeral processing is going on in her own mind. She feels many funeral attendees are moving back and forth in her head. The poet metaphorically represents her mind as a two-story building. While the poet herself is lying on a bed in the ground floor, the funeral that she is feeling is going on in the upper floor of her brain. The activity on the upper floor is so haste that the poet fears that the floor will break down under the stress and the reason itself will fall down from her mind through the newly created creek or opening. That is, the poet worries that she is losing her sense of reason. The funeral attendees finally settle in their seats and start offering their prayers. Funeral services. However, the poet cannot exactly hear any word. She cannot see the funeral processing going on in her head. She can just feel it and hear the drumming beats of their prayers. As the funeral services end and the funeral processing begins, the mourners lift a box which appears like a coffin and carry it walking across the poet's soul. And when they walk, her soul creaks as if it is an old wooden floor. All the mourners appear to be wearing heavy lead boots, and that is why the poet suffers extreme strain. Suddenly, the poet hears a loud ring, but it doesn't appear coming from a bell or a single source. Rather, it is coming from the whole world. The poet feels that the ringing is coming even from the sky and possibly from the heaven itself. Then the poet feels her mind going numb, and she finds herself no more a human, but a strange creature who is alone, trapped in her own body and mind, which appears to be a vast, lonely sea in which she is shipwrecked. At the end, one of the wood plank of her metaphorical floor of mind's second floor, breaks, and it creates a huge hole through which the reason falls. As the poet falls, she strikes and collides with the whole world and continues to fall until the poet's mind shuts down altogether and it goes completely numb. Now the poet is not able to understand anything at all. The poet is about to speak what happens then in the afterlife, and the poem ends. One of the themes of this poem is madness, a sense of terminally ill person losing her mind and senses. The major theme of the poem is irrationality of the world. The poet sees reason breaking down and realizes that all the reason and our presumed order are just man-made, devised. They are not real, and in real nature reason fails. The seventh poem of Emily Dickinson that we will discuss is A Bird Came Down the Walk. A bird came down the walk, he did not know I saw. He bit an angleworm in hulls and ate the fellow raw. This poem shows the deep observatory skills of Dickinson as a poet, and it proves that a person doesn't need to travel a lot to many countries and far off lands to gain skill and acumen to be a great writer. Remember, Dickinson was aware of Emerson and his essay The American Scholar, and she proves it with this poem. Dickinson spent most of her life in Amherst. She hardly went out of her home place, yet she was such a great observer that she could create such beautiful poems. In this poem, Dickinson depicts a bird and describes that once she saw a bird coming down the walk on the ground. The bird was unaware that the poet was observing it. Dickinson uses him and he for the bird, personifying the bird as a man. He was unaware he was being watched. The poet sees the bird biting an angleworm in two halves and eating it raw. Then the poet observes the bird drinking water from the dew of the grass. The bird then observes a beetle going through the path and he hops away towards the side wall to let the beetle pass comfortably. The bird was cautious of any imminent danger. He was frightened and alert, and the poet could feel the bird. The bird observes all around himself with cautious eyes in a hurried manner, and it stirs his head in all directions. The poet then offers a crumb, a little morsel of food for the bird. But the bird doesn't take interest. He rolls his feather and flies away, and his flight appears so gentle as if the oars have divided the waters of sea. Without any trouble, or as if the butterfly leaps from one flower to other of banks of noon, effortlessly. The bird appears to swim without causing any sound of splash. The next poem of Emily which we are going to discuss is I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died. I heard a fly buzz when I died. The stillness in the room was like the stillness in the air between the heaves of storm. The poem describes the mental distractions caused by irrelevant, minute details that can affect a person even at the most crucial moments of his life, even at the moment of his death. The poem then becomes more macabre and strange when the poet reflects that the tiny unnoticeable fly is the death itself. The poem again personifies the death. The poet is dead and is describing what happened just before her death. The poet says that she heard a fly buzzing around her as she was laying on her deathbed. She was about to die, but she could hear that fly buzzing incessantly. Everything else was silent and still in that room, as the air between the heaves of a storm. There were people and mourners around her who were crying and weeping. The poet was firming her breath for that last onset, that is her death. Then she metaphorically expresses the death as the king to come in the room. The poet then offers her will to the mourners, distributing all that she had. Right then, the poet hears the fly buzzing again, and this buzz interposes itself between a blue, unclear light and the poet. Then the windows fail and everything becomes dark. The poet dies. The second last poem of Dickinson that we are going to discuss is A Light Exists in the Spring. A light exists in spring, not present on the ear at any other period, when March is scarcely here. This poem is a nature poem in which Dickinson reveals the beauty of spring season. It is also a religious poem, as Dickinson mentions in the last stanza of the poem. The poet says that there exists a light in the season of spring which doesn't appear through the rest of the year. That light begins to glow as the month of March comes across. The horizon starts glowing with the distinctive color on the distant hills. The poet says that science and reason cannot describe this light, but the human nature experiences it. This light lingers in our lawns, and it also reveals itself on the faraway trees on hills. The poet says that the light is so strong as if it can directly speak to the poet. Then the light starts going weak, and as the time passes, the light passes away, leaving us behind. This loss or passing away of this spiritual light affects us, and we feel less contented, as if some of the divinity of the religious sacrament has been robbed. The last poem that we will discuss is Tell All the Truth, but Tell It Slant. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise. This poem is an instructive poem in which the poet directs the readers. It appears that Dickinson is advising the poets about how to express their poetry. The poet says that a poet or anyone in general should always express or tell only the truth. Then the poet says that not half or partial, but all the complete truth should be told. However, the poet instructs that the truth shouldn't be told plainly or directly. It should be expressed in a slant, circuitous manner because the success of truth lies in the circuits in which it is presented. The poet reasons why it happens. Dickinson says that often the surprising power of truth is too strong for the generally weak perceptions of the reader or listener. They will be overwhelmed by it. So write in the way in which a teacher explains the truth about the magnificent but frightening thunder lightning to the children while lessening their fear and awe. A poet should reveal all the truth to the people in a gentle, slant manner. This will help people in seeing the truth by themselves. Otherwise, the people may get dazzled and blind. So we have discussed 10 most important poems of Emily Dickinson. We will continue to discuss American literature in English in upcoming videos. Please stay connected with the discourse. Thanks and regards.